Hello, our topic today is going to be the Dwight Eisenhower foreign policy that dominated the 1950s. We can certainly say that Eisenhower's foreign policy has many similarities to the Harry S. Truman foreign policy of the 1940s and into the 1950s. Specifically, that Eisenhower was adhering completely to the Truman Doctrine. Remember, the Truman Doctrine really set the table for the U.S. participation in the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine really revolutionized the way that the United States approached the rest of the world. The Truman Doctrine being this call for the United States to prevent communism from spreading any further, contain communism to where it already existed, and this would require the United States to become the world's policeman, operate on a very vigilant level, to make sure that not 1 inch of soil fell into the communist sphere. And Eisenhower, being a Cold War president following Truman, was going to continue this newfound role of the United States, and it would be continued also by the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, the Nixon administration, Ford, Carter, Reagan, up into the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. And in many ways, you can say that the Truman Doctrine, in some ways, extended beyond the Cold War into the Clinton years, into the George W. Bush years, and still is very much alive during the Barack Obama administration. But here we are, Eisenhower elected to office in 1952, takes the oath of office in 1953, and expresses his commitment to the Truman Doctrine, to his effort to make sure that the United States ultimately wins this conflict, wins this Cold War against the Soviet Union and communism in general. But there's one thing that Eisenhower has to recognize coming into office and being privy to information that generally only the president has information to. Certainly he was also going to have to make some difficult decisions in regards to which programs would ultimately receive how much funding from the federal government. And we would assume that Eisenhower, being a committed Cold Warrior, a committed supporter of the Truman Doctrine, and being a military man himself, having been in the military most of his life, having been the most famous general coming out of World War II, as he led the D-Day invasion and commanded Allied forces in the European theater, and going on to be the Supreme Commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, during the early stages of the Cold War, would be committed to making sure that the military was funded to the hilt. However, Eisenhower was somewhat of a pragmatist. He was a moderate. I think some could argue that he had a great deal of common sense, was a big picture individual, and was a little bit taken aback when he assumed the responsibilities of Commander-in-Chief, but also as President of domestic life in the United States, when he found that 60% of the federal budget, a full 60% of the federal budget, was going into defense. It was expensive, this Truman Doctrine. It was expensive for the United States to be the world's policeman. Building up our nuclear arsenal, making sure that the traditional military was completely flush, making sure the Army and the Marines and the Air Force and the Navy had state-of-the-art equipment, making sure that allies were well funded, make sure that NATO had all the resources it needed. This was going to cost just an incredible amount. But 60% of the federal budget, how did it really reach that level? Well, it reached that level during the Truman administration, and it reached that level in large part because of the recommendations coming out of the National Security Council. And if you go to slide number 2, you'll see NSC 68, Truman administration. And now NSC 68 refers to the National Security Council document number 68. The National Security Council is a bureaucracy that develops here during the early stages of the Cold War to make sure that the United States is well positioned to win the Cold War. We have the top brass of all four branches of the military, leading advisors, putting together recommendations for the Commander-in-Chief, the President, and the NSC 68. This document that comes out of this defense bureaucracy recommends that Truman spend whatever it takes to make sure that this Cold War is won, and Truman buys into it. He wants to make sure that his Truman Doctrine is ultimately upheld, and this gains momentum to the point that by the time Eisenhower takes office, we just have so much of the nation's resources going into the military. Now, of course, if 60% is going to the military, that means there's only 40% left to go into infrastructure development, or into education, or into health care, or any number of programs that the federal government might want to create for its citizens in order to stimulate and modernize domestic life. And Eisenhower recognizes that 60% of the federal budget going to the military is unsustainable and would ultimately lead to perhaps a lowering of the standard of life in America. And this Cold War shouldn't just be about fighting against communism abroad, but maintaining a high standard of living under capitalism at home, which would require some government oversight, and that requires some funding that may not be there if this trend continues in terms of funding the military at ever-increasing levels. And so shortly after taking the oath of office, Eisenhower delivers a speech. And in this speech, he has this to say on slide number 3. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. And I actually very much admire this speech. I believe that Eisenhower is getting the big picture. And I find this to be particularly interesting considering the background of Dwight Eisenhower, being a military man, living his life in uniform, being a general, and recognizing how important resources are, money is, expenditures are to a viable military. But he also believes there needs to be a balancing act, that 60% of the federal budget is too much, and actually, as he puts it, is a theft from domestic affairs at home. So Eisenhower's basic premise here, coming into office, is to uphold the Truman Doctrine, do whatever it takes to win this Cold War, to contain communism to where it already exists, and allow capitalism to be the economic model of the world, and have communism go the way of the dodo bird. But do it in a way that doesn't bankrupt the country, do it in a way that doesn't preclude the United States from developing up to its potential. And so, in short, what we have here with Eisenhower's so-called New Look foreign policy is a commitment to winning the Cold War, but doing it on the cheap. And this becomes known, as I said, as the New Look foreign policy. And if we turn to slide number 4, we will see that there are several components of this New Look foreign policy. Now, first, we have arm allies and reduce the traditional U.S. military. And this, of course, would be a cost-saving move. Eisenhower is actually a rather consistent fellow in many regards. He always was concerned about putting American soldiers in harm's way, or anybody who served under his command in harm's way. He believed that you could win the Cold War by creating allies and funding the efforts of allies to fight against communism on their own. To be specific, if the United States provides Greek soldiers with some funding, or some Pakistani soldiers with some funding, with enough money to buy uniforms, buy weapons, buy ammunition, buy other supplies, they can fight against communism on their own. And this would be much cheaper than having to pay a U.S. soldier a salary, perhaps a pension, perhaps a participation in the GI Bill, which might cost the federal government a fair amount of money going forward, without veterans benefits. It would be much cheaper to put a Pakistani in a uniform or a Greek in a uniform to fight against communism on their own, rather than having to deploy American forces. But also, if you could avoid putting American soldiers in harm's way, why not? This would be certainly a way of saving money, and certainly a way of saving American lives, with the net result still being a prevention of communism spreading any further. The idea was that it might cost the U.S. government $2,500 a year to deploy an American soldier to Greece, where it might cost the U.S. government only $500 a year to make sure a Greek soldier was uniformed and supplied. Same being said in, say, Pakistan or somewhere else around the world. So this is a way that Eisenhower can reconcile this idea of decreasing military funding, but at the same time continually enforcing the Bull-Truman doctrine. Now, certainly he wants to pair this, Eisenhower wants to pair this with some other strategies, one of them being the buildup of the United States nuclear arsenal. The nuclear monopoly has been broken. As we mentioned in a previous lecture, the Soviet Union successfully tested an atomic weapon before the end of the 1940s. The United States developed a hydrogen bomb. The Soviet Union followed suit shortly after that. The United States and the Soviet Union are going to continually develop the awesome power of their nuclear weapons, more destructive capabilities, increase the number of nuclear weapons that each country has, develop more sophisticated deployment systems like intercontinental ballistic missiles or MIRVs, and this is part and parcel to the Cold War, this nuclear arms race, and Eisenhower is bent on winning the nuclear arms race. He believes nuclear weapons, or the super weapon, can help the United States enforce the Truman Doctrine throughout the world and ultimately win the Cold War. Now, it's going to be very expensive to put so much money into the nuclear program, but less money day in and day out than would be expended on making sure that the four branches of the traditional military were as well funded, as large as they had been during Truman's administration. Now, how would this work on the ground floor? Well, Eisenhower can employ the philosophy of brinksmanship. The idea being that the United States would be willing to go to the brink of nuclear confrontation under the idea that enemies would surrender rather than have hell unleashed upon them. So, for example, if there was a civil war in a country somewhere on the planet, where you have a communist faction fighting against a capitalist faction, the United States could fund the capitalist faction, make sure that they have plenty of money to fight a modern war and maybe have a leg up against their communist opponents. But if it looks as if the communists are going to ultimately win the Civil War, then the United States can kind of, like a big brother, step forward and threaten the communist faction with nuclear attack. The United States would be willing to go to the brink of nuclear attack. Now, if the communist faction decided to call the U.S. bluff, then the United States might be forced to deploy nuclear weapons and attack that country. With that said, the philosophy would be that any sane leader of any communist faction around the planet would not want to risk this parade of horribles that would ensue, and would ultimately surrender and back down. So the United States would have all of these nuclear weapons with sophisticated delivery systems that could ultimately be used as a bargaining chip to enforce the Truman Doctrine around the world. Now, of course, this does not solve the direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, which also has nuclear weapons, and lots of them, and ever more sophisticated delivery systems. And so we get what's known as mutually assured destruction. This was going to be the philosophical underpinning of the New Look foreign policy. The idea is that, yes, the Soviet Union has nuclear weapons, the United States has nuclear weapons, but if we have more nuclear weapons than the Soviet Union, then we'll be able to destroy them more than they can destroy us. And this will ultimately serve as a deterrent from Soviet attack. Mutually assured destruction becomes a very important part of Cold War international politics, and really casts a long shadow over the decades that make up the Cold War, and create a real ominous feeling for those who are living during the Cold War. If the Soviet Union attacks the United States with a nuclear weapon, the United States would attack in kind, and the Soviet Union would retaliate in kind, and this could ultimately destroy the planet as we know it. World War III would be the end of days, so to speak. So here we have a new look foreign policy that calls for the reduction in expenditures that go into defense, but also creating a philosophy that will enable the United States to ultimately uphold the Truman Doctrine and win this Cold War. But it's a very sketchy set of philosophical principles here. The brinksmanship and mutually assured destruction, of course, threaten the use of nuclear weapons and perhaps retaliation on the part of the Soviet Union using nuclear weapons as well, which creates a very unstable dynamic. Now, of course, mutually assured destruction is the foreign policy of the Soviet Union as well. We have two countries that are armed to the hilt with nuclear weapons, and fortunately the leaders of those two superpowers were sane enough to never deploy nuclear weapons out of fear that there would be massive retaliation. So it ended up working during the Cold War, but certainly nobody had a crystal ball and could look into the future. Nobody knew it was going to work, and therefore there was a lot of anxiety and insecurity that went into international politics, international relations. And during the 1950s, we have a lot of people hollowing out their basements, turning them into bunkers, stockpiling canned foods, and buying lead blankets, and these sorts of things. So it is certainly an age of anxiety in the 1950s and throughout much of the Cold War. And that is the reality. Okay, so during this first lecture, we have established Eisenhower's foreign policy, why it came into existence. It came into existence because 60% of the federal budget was going to defense, and Eisenhower did not believe this was sustainable, and in some ways he did not think it was even moral. So he crafted a less expensive foreign policy that would still enable him to enforce the Truman Doctrine, contain communism to where it already exists, and ultimately defeat the Soviet Union and communism here in the midst of this Cold War. And his new look foreign policy called for continually arming our allies who were willing to fight against communism in their neck of the woods, while reducing the traditional U.S. military, fewer men in uniform, fewer naval ships out at sea, fewer tanks stationed abroad, would be a major cost saver to the United States. But nuclear weapons were going to be a central component to this new look foreign policy. The United States would threaten to use its nuclear weapons that it was developing at a breakneck pace against communists in countries throughout the world, communist factions throughout countries in the world, and also use its nuclear capabilities to jockey for position against the other superpower of the Soviet Union. Now, with that said, the new look foreign policy also has a very clandestine component to it, a secretive component to it, a component in which the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, is going to play a very important role. So when we come back to the New Look Foreign Policy Part 2 lecture, we will evaluate how the New Look Foreign Policy operated on the ground floor and problematize it. What were the benefits of the New Look Foreign Policy on the ground floor, and what were some of the long-lasting negative ramifications that came about as a result of Eisenhower's strategy here in the 1950s. So I'll see you for the New Look Foreign Policy Lecture Part 2.